Happy New Year, degenerates, degeneritos, and degenerati, and welcome back to the first MMA RAXPOD of 2025 for UFC 11, Tsarukyan versus Makhachev. Or is it Makhachev versus Tsarukyan? I would think it's probably champion first, right? It's actually, no, I screwed it up both times. It's Makhachev Tsarukyan 2, because this is a rematch. This was Arman Tsarukyan's UFC debut, in which he lost a more contested than expected decision to Islam Makhachev. The first event I ever taped when I started doing my analysis before I started MMA Rax officially or went live with it a while ago. This was the first fight, was one of the first ones I watched, because the first event I did was Makhachev versus Green, the fight night all the way back in February of 2022, almost 3 years ago now. And also fighting on that card was Arman Tsarukyan against Joel Alvarez. Makhachev was too expensive in that fight with Bobby Green that was on short notice, but I still ended up siding with him that night. I did fade Tsarukyan in favor of Joel Alvarez and took that one on the chin. So ever since I watched that first fight between these two in preparation for that event, I've long figured that this was eventually going to be a meeting for the title whenever Makhachev became champion, and given how young Tsarukyan was then and already ascending up the lightweight rankings, it felt like it was only a matter of time. And here we are. And as an added bonus, we get what I think is, to be perfectly frank, an even more compelling title fight between Umar Nurmagomedov and the reigning Merab Dvalishvili. Now, it's a new year. I say every single time that I'm going to try to keep this short, and then in cases where I've got to talk about a dozen or more fights, end up going for pretty close to 2.5 hours. If you've listened to any of the last couple of Rax pods all the way through, I thank you very much, and I would ask you again to please like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow on X, Twitter, whatever you fancy at this point. But if you've listened to the last two, you know that I've got a lot of stuff going on. So as I'm recording this on Tuesday night, the night of fight week, I really do need to go to bed in preparation for other professional commitments. So I don't really have the time to be as long-winded as I would like to be about these fights. I normally do like to get about 10 minutes of analysis in for each of those, but that is pretty taxing. So I am really going to try, and I know I say I'm going to try every time, but I am really going to try at this point to just really rip through all of these, especially because if you were paying attention to the picks last week, I've also started mixing in picks for the women's fights. Now, the only pick I actually had last week went 0 for 1. And I'm not going to really... The other change I'm going to do going forward, just so we can get into these pretty quick, because I'm already about 4 minutes into the intro here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time recapping the events from the previous week at this point. I tried to go out of the way of doing that whenever I had, made a lot of mistakes, just so that we as bettors together could go over where, you can realize where you went wrong and incorporate that into your decision making going forward. In a couple years down the road, when the RAXPOD is out of beta, the beta, it's been in for a year and a half at this point, and will continue to be in beta until the time comes to go live with the platform. Once we've got more time to dedicate to the show overall, could probably go back to some kind of format with that, or spin it off into perhaps its own set of content, whether in written or video or podcasting format. But for the time being, I'm going to stop doing the event recaps to lead out the show, just because it normally shoves another 20 or 30 minutes in, that kind of elongates the program longer than perhaps some people feel it needs to be. So if you do enjoy me doing that, if for nothing else than the accountability, I do apologize. That being said, in the interest of expediting the show, I am going to just try to jump into this event. So we've got about, like I said, a little over a dozen fights. We did have a couple cancellations. I wasn't going to have a pick on the Guskov. I forget who he was fighting before his fight got canceled. That was earlier in the week. Yesterday, a couple hours before I was going to put out Zachary Reese over Cedric Dumas, that got canceled. That was unfortunate. I know a lot of people were feeling very confident in Reese. Reese was one of my most confident picks of the card, too. So shame to lose that, but there's still plenty of fighters that are available in similar price range to what Reese was. And we will get into all of those in very short order. But we will start with Tagir Ulanbekov and Clayton Carpenter. Ulanbekov enters 15-2. His last appearance was at UFC 296, where he submitted Cody Durden. He was supposed to fight at an event in June of last year, I believe, against Joshua Van, but totally blew his weight cut. I think weighed in at like 129.5 pounds, so 3.5 pounds over the flyweight limit, which is 3.5 pounds is a bad miss by itself, but for flyweight in particular is a pretty egregious weight miss. The fight did not proceed, and consequently Ulanbekov has not fought in over a year. Conversely, Clayton Carpenter enters 8-0, has only had about 3 UFC appearances if you include Contender Series, which was arguably his most impressive performance relative to strength of schedule, where he beat Edgar Cairez by unanimous decision. I think in most people's estimation, losing the first round and having to come back and win the final 10 minutes. So it was an impressive performance in that respect. Didn't compete until February of 2023 again, where he took down Juan Camilo Ronderos, who did not last around the UFC very long. Followed that up with a win over Lucas Rocha at Fight Night Royval Tyra. In all of his appearances, I have made him a parlay leg. I guess both of his UFC appearances specifically, I felt very good about him relative to the level of competition he was facing. I know Lucas Rocha was a somewhat popular underdog pick back in October. Most people, I guess, weren't super convinced on Carpenter, even though he was the favorite. I felt pretty good about him, and I feel good about him in this spot too, at least at the value that he's currently sitting at, which is plus 250. Ulanbekov is a 3-1 favorite at minus 300, and I do understand it to a certain extent. A lot of people are openly touting they think that this guy, his strength of schedule is just much, much higher. And it's true to a certain extent. I mean, he does have 8 years ago a win over Asu Almabayev that has aged considerably well. That being said, Almabayev was 22 years old at the time, so still a very, very young prospect, not anywhere even close to reaching his prime. And, you have to wonder if they ran that fight back now, how much more Almabayev would be competitive in it, particularly because Ulanbekov knocked him out in the final 10 seconds of that fight, as opposed to it being a first-round starching or something. Lost a majority decision to Zalga Zumagulov, which is interesting. The guy beat Almabayev and lost to Zumagulov within the same, not quite the same calendar year, about a year and a half. Lost a unanimous decision to Tim Elliott that, frankly, I don't think he deserved to lose. That was the first pay-per-view that I ever did my analysis for, and I think I made Ulanbekov a parlay leg, so I went out very early that night, and I was pretty upset, given Elliott even admitted in wake of that fight that he had pretty much blatantly cheated and gotten away with it. And that fight took place shortly after the war in Ukraine broke out, And I couldn't help but feel like maybe there was a little bit of bias towards the Russians, at least in that moment, that may have factored into the scorecards. And it's something I've been a little bit wary of in terms of betting Russian fighters ever since, which has been, hit or miss. It was something I considered when Gon fought Volkov. It wasn't the only reason that I thought Gon would curry more favor from the judges than Volkov would, but I mean, you see how that ended up playing out when it went to decision. In any event, I do think that Carpenter's being a little disrespected on the line here, especially because the difference in ring rust is so crazy. Again, Carpenter fought back in October, so he's barely been on the shelf for like 3 months, which is like the perfect amount of time that I think you want off or taking between fights, regardless of how much damage you've suffered. That's like pretty much the perfect amount of time between being able to recover and go into another camp for a new fight and just kind of staying fresh in terms of comfortable with being in an actual fight scenario inside of the octagon, which Tagir Ulanbekov, for all of his experience, has not been in now for over a year. And he's been much, much more active in earlier stages of his career, particularly in the years leading up to when he actually got into the UFC. But he's basically been a once-a-year fighter ever since he debuted against Bruno Silva to a unanimous decision. I do expect Ulanbekov to be a little bit better on the feet than Carpenter. I do think Carpenter's striking gets a little bit more discredited just because he kind of grades out as a bit more of a wrestle boxer than anything else. But I do think that the difference in the ability on the ground between these two guys is not as stark as a lot of people make it out to be. I don't consider, even though Ulanbekov is kind of the Nurmagomedov cousin that most people forget about, he really doesn't have, I don't think, the same kind of wrestling and grappling pedigree that his presumed training partners at Eagles MMA, or if he's been spending time at AKA with Makhachev, he's just not quite up to that same standard. A lot of people like to say those Dagestani fighters, they're either the kind of mold of Makhachev and Khabib, where they're just kind of very aggressive wrestler grappler hybrids with seemingly unlimited mountain man gas tanks, or they're like the Saeed Nurmagomedovs, who just throw a lot of spitting stuff but are pretty consistent with it, but have a little bit suspect gas tanks. I don't think Tagir really leans on the spinning stuff as much, and arguably his two most impressive performances in the UFC have been his last two fights. Again, the issue is one of them was at the end of 2022 against somebody that is no longer on the UFC roster in Nate Maness, and the other one was Cody Durden, which has aged not super great, but also, I think most people would say Cody Durden's a fairly respectable fighter. I certainly would. He's someone that I backed as an underdog several times. I did most recently in his fight with Joshua Van. I did in his fight against Ulanbekov, where I also thought he was being disrespected. But I don't know if Durden had the same advantage in ring rust in that fight relative to this one. I would think he probably had something similar. But I am going to be going with Carpenter here. I'll say that Carpenter is able to squeak out a 29-28 decision, just kind of being the more impressive fighter on the ground for at least two of the rounds. Most likely having the American crowd on his side. I know he's not really, I don't think he's a California kid. There's not really a lot of California fighters on this card, but for the sheer novelty of the American crowd rooting against the Russians, which I do think is going to be a little bit of a theme for the Russian fighters that are on this card, I would expect Carpenter to make a bit better of an impression and to get a 29-28 decision from the judges. So give me a pretty big upset here to open things out with Clayton Carpenter getting a unanimous decision. The next fight is Bernardo Sopaj and Ricky Turcios. Sopaj enters 11-3, last appeared in March of last year, where he was on the wrong end of what many people considered the best knockout of the year, which was a flying knee from Vinicius Oliveira. About a round and a half prior to that, he was a minus 2,800 live favorite against the fighter now known as Lock Dog, one of the more exciting prospects in the bantamweight division. Although Sopaj, at 24 years old, has plenty of time to carve out that role for himself in his own right. And I believe he was a short notice replacement for that fight with Oliveira and gave a very good account of himself, just didn't have a full camp and got tired and consequently ended up on the wrong end of one of the highlights of the year. Conversely, Ricky Turcios last appeared in June of last year, getting submitted for the first time in his MMA career by Raul Rosas Jr., was then supposed to fight Sopaj at Fight Night. I believe it was Protest versus Magny in November. And when this fight got canceled because Turcios did not get medical clearance after looking like pretty bad at weigh-ins, if memory serves correctly, I considered just sitting out this event entirely, but being in a position where there weren't really that many cards left in the year, I decided to stay in and over-leveraged on a parlay where I don't think I had more than like 5 picks for that card because there had already been like 3 other cancellations earlier in the week, and then we lost this fight after weigh-ins, and I was like, all right, this is ridiculous, but didn't want to sit out at that point. I'd already sat out of like 4 other Apex events during the year that I felt like I didn't have great reads on, that there weren't a lot of great betting opportunities relative to parlays, and ended up getting burned. So I really had wanted to play Sopaj back then, and that was back when he was around minus 350. He was pretty much the same price earlier this week, going into the rebooking, right around 360. Interestingly enough, in the last day, his price has come way down from around 350 to roughly minus 280. So he's back in the 200 range. And that makes him extremely intriguing to me, given that I don't really see what is terribly different this time around relative to Sopaj. I think if you're betting Turcios, you have to feel more concerned about the fact that this guy didn't pull himself out of the fight after weigh-ins, but anytime a guy is just bailing on the fight, period, you have to feel a little bit concerned about that. Now, I've made exceptions to that before. I didn't really think Junyong Park missing medical clearance for the first time he was booked to fight Brad Tavares was a big deal. Ended up betting him with confidence on the rebooking. Should have gotten a unanimous decision, but ended up getting a split. But I do think it's a little bit different in this case with Turcios, just because he's had a history of pulling out of fights before. And not only that, but has been kind of a vocal critic of when other of his opponents have done that themselves. You'll recall when Rosas had to pull out of the UFC Mexico City event, Turcios was very, very upset about that and let the media know as much. The other thing that concerns me about Turcios here is that, if you take away his tough semifinal appearance against Ludwig Shalinian, I believe was his name. The high stand fight, I mean, both of his wins after he won the Ultimate Fighter have been split decisions, one of which is against a fighter in Kevin Natividad, who, frankly, I thought was pretty dreadful and is no longer on the UFC roster, but made that fight much closer than I expected it to be just because Turcios was very fast and loose with it, or fast not in a good way, just like very loose and wild and reckless, which is kind of how he's been in all of his fights. I think even though Sopaj is younger and less experienced than Turcios is slightly, particularly relative to the UFC, but just in terms of MMA experience overall, I think you have to look at that performance against Vinicius Oliveira and think this is still a guy that fights with more discipline than what we've seen from Turcios, especially against Raul Rosas Jr. He was very vocal and, did not really do a good job keeping composure. The Ayman Zahabi performance is one that a lot of folks felt really let down by. I remember making him parlay leg for that event, as I did against Kevin Natividad. I mean, this is a fighter that coming out of TUF, I thought the UFC really wanted to prop up a little bit, and that I felt pretty good about in terms of the matchmaking he was getting going forward. But the Zahabi performance, I mean, he just got totally outclassed, was doing just a lot of wild gesturing and stuff, and a big red flag I remember hearing about early in the time that I started looking into doing this as more than just a hobby is anytime you're seeing a fighter just kind of celebrating what their effort has been, gesturing after the fight, raising their hand in the air while the scorecards are being read, and then they lose a 30-27 or something, and then they act surprised that they lost. Anytime a fighter thinks that they're winning when it's pretty evident to everybody watching and judging the fight that isn't the case, that's a pretty big red flag in terms of kind of evaluating fight IQ. And there's so many traits here that Turcios has demonstrated since that narrow win in the TUF finale that I think just make him not only very difficult to trust, but also very tempting to fade. Which is what I did when he fought Raul Rosas Jr., and it's what I'm going to do again here. I kind of struggle to see why the value has kind of come down where it is at this point. My assumption is people are looking at what happened with Sopaj gassing out against Oliveira in his only other UFC appearance, and thinking that Turcios, given one of the things that you can say about him that's fairly consistent is his cardio, that Turcios is going to be able to withstand any sort of early barrage or ground attack, and is going to be able to weaponize his cardio to winning the last 10 minutes of this. It's not a far-fetched argument, but the counter I would have for that is that Sopaj took that fight against Oliveira on short notice and still very, very there. I can't remember if he ended up losing the second round on the scorecards that did get turned in, but if that fight did end up going the distance and he didn't get knocked out, it would have been interesting to see how the judges scored it relative to, it was very, very clear he won the first round. The second round, he had been winning through the first half of it to the point where he was a 2,800 live favorite, and then he ended up losing down the stretch. So now he's got a full camp to make sure his own cardio's dialed in and that he's prepared. And this is the second time that he's been preparing to fight this specific guy who has struggled to get momentum going in his own career in the UFC since winning Ultimate Fighter. If it does go to decision, I am going to be a little bit nervous that the UFC will try to prop up its Ultimate Fighter winner if it is close in certain respects. But I do think Sopaj is the harder hitter, just the more all-around disciplined fighter based on what we've seen, with a higher potential ceiling than what Turcios has demonstrated over the last 3 years. So I felt comfortable playing him in the 300 range. I kind of had to talk myself into it a little bit back in November. In wake of what's happened since then, I would have felt more confident playing him in that range. Now that he's dipped into the 280 range, I'm going to have to heavily consider making him a parlay leg this week, just because I'm really not sold on Turcios any longer. So, Turcios has been knocked out before at the hands of Mana Martinez all the way back in 2018. So he's been caught in the first round before, and Sopaj does hit fairly hard. Although Vinicius Oliveira was somebody that had been finished prior to getting to the UFC multiple times, and Sopaj wasn't able to finish him, although, again, short notice appearance. I will say that Sopaj does get a finish here. I'll say that he knocks out Turcios in the second round after kind of putting on more than I think Turcios is going to expect he's going to receive. I think it's similar to what happened against Raul Rosas, where Turcios is a little bit overconfident going into the matchup, and Sopaj gives him back more than he's expecting and is kind of caught off guard, goes back to the corner a little bit disheartened, and then the two of them come back out, and Sopaj is able to finish taking care of business in the second round. So give me Sopaj to win by second round TKO. The next fight is Rinya Nakamura and Muin Gafurov. Nakamura enters 9-0, last fought almost a year ago at UFC 298 against Carlos Vera. That was my last clean sweep, and I obviously wouldn't have bet the Nakamura fight just because Carlos Vera had not fought in the UFC yet, I don't believe. And I don't believe he's fought since, and I think he probably got cut immediately after that fight, just because all he did was attempt leg locks the entire time. But Nakamura wasn't able to finish him. Some people were disappointed by that. And some people were disappointed by the Fernie Garcia performance too, although I think Garcia is a little bit better than what his UFC tenure ended up revealing, just because he ended up getting some more difficult than anticipated matchups. But, I digress. Nakamura is still 9-0. He's, when I put out the pick earlier this week, he was a minus 400 favorite. He's now ballooned out to minus 550, which is kind of crazy, but at the same time, I still get it. And honestly, I think he's probably still playable even at that price, which is not something I often say. Conversely, Muin Gafurov enters 19-6. Last won at UFC Fight Night Whitaker Alaskarov in Saudi Arabia, where he beat Kyung Ho Kang by unanimous decision. I had picked Kyung Ho Kang as a underdog in that fight. I thought Kang was going to have an argument for winning the fight up until I believe he got dropped in the final 30 seconds or something. It was very, very much maybe not even 30 seconds, last 10 seconds of the fight he got dropped, which ended up swinging the round in Gafurov's favor on, I think, all of the scorecards. I believe one judge did score it 30-27, which I remember being kind of upset about, if memory serves correct. In fact, go figure, all the judges scored it 30-27. None of the judges gave the second round to Kyung Ho Kang. I thought that was a pretty straightforward case of hometown cooking, where if that fight had not been taking place in Saudi Arabia, I don't want to quite call it hometown cooking because, Tajikistan's obviously not really even close to Saudi Arabia, but still felt pretty evident on that card that they were trying to prop up the more fighters affiliated with the region, if you want to call it that. So I thought Gafurov got some favorable judging in that case. I did fade him when he fought John Castaneda, and also faded him as a parlay leg when he fought the much more talented Said Nurmagomedov. Pretty much, I don't really want to hark on this one too long, just because, again, the price has gotten ridiculous. I would, if this gets out to 600, which I hope it doesn't, I wouldn't really bother considering Nakamura. He is, pretty highly touted wrestling prospect. I actually heard his father is the owner of one of the big Japanese MMA promotions, Pancrase, on another show this week. I believe that was on the show that DFS by the Numbers does with Uncle Wheezy. I believe Uncle Wheezy was the one that said that, for those that are familiar. I can neither confirm or deny that, but if you trust Uncle Wheezy's expertise, then you can roll with that factoid. I I do. The main thing that concerns me here with this matchup is that, and this is just something that's going to concern me with Gafurov in general, and it's something that I don't like about his fellow Tajiki, Mohamed Naimov either, is that both guys are just absolutely dreadful going the distance. They cannot have very good gas tanks because their record going to decisions is terrible. Prior to Gafurov getting the 30-27 against Kyung-Ho Kang, Gafurov only had one unanimous decision win in his entire MMA career. So make of that what you will. I believe he only had one that went to a split decision, but it was a loss, and it was his fight on Contender Series against Chad Anheliger. He had to make 2 appearances in LFA before getting another shot in the UFC, and that was when he lost to John Castaneda in 2023. So I do feel pretty good about Nakamura if he's able to avoid getting sparked by the... Really, the only edge that I give Gafurov here is that he's the harder hitter, and I think under most circumstances that would be enough for me to prompt for a stay away. But I just don't really think that there's much going for Gafurov here further than, you can say strength of schedule, sure. But further than him having more experience going the distance, it's not like he has great experience going the distance. He hasn't really done a great job managing his gas tank. So I think Nakamura is probably going to end up winning at least a 29-28 decision here. There's a possibility that he's able to finish Gafurov if Gafurov gets extremely tired with all of the wrestling. I do think he's probably going to get pushed more in that department than he has in any of the previous 4 appearances. And Kyung-Ho Kang, it's like I said, I was fairly shocked watching that fight that the judges, in retrospect, I wasn't shocked because, again, the context around the event relative to who Gafurov is. That being said, I was stunned that he didn't get at least 1 round scored for him, and pretty much all of the success that he had on that fight was when he was bringing it to the ground. So I expect Nakamura, fresh off of that performance for Gafurov, to be able to implement similar things more consistently over the course of 15 minutes. The other thing I'll say, too, is the UFC is gonna... look, they've put resources into trying to make Road to UFC work, okay? You can tell that they're sort of slowly trying to distance themselves from tough just because the return from prospects hasn't been great, and particularly for hosting events in America, they're just able to generate so much more consistent and potential championship caliber and contender talent off of, go figure, Contender Series. But for the purpose of making the UFC product more relevant in Asia, it is important for them to want to get people to turn into Road to UFC. And the only way that you do that is if you churn out winners of Road to UFC consistently into prospects that people want to watch, which they have struggled immensely to do, whether it be Anshul Jubli or the guy that got knocked out by Hyder Emil that I backed in that fight when they just kind of threw caution to the wind and then he ended up getting knocked out. They've struggled to put together and then I think Yusaku Kinoshita, I believe is his name, the guy that the people were saying was Japanese Conor McGregor, is another good example of that. They've struggled to prop up their champions against even the lowest caliber UFC talent, which I think they're really... I think it explains why they matched up Nakamura with both Fernie Garcia and Carlos Vera. And Garcia was a pretty durable fighter, so I don't hold it against him. He wasn't able to finish him. Carlos Vera, you probably would have liked to see him submit Vera just because Vera's been submitted before, but he's also someone that's never been knocked out, and he was fighting that ridiculous leg lock style where, unless you're a guy like Dan Hooker fighting Claudio Puelles, you're probably gonna struggle to do more than just avoid getting your knee torn up and actually finishing that fight. So Nakamura is a little bit older than I think you would like to see relative to how many fights that he has, but I mean, I'm not holding that against a guy like Clayton Carpenter either further down this card, who some people would argue has fought a similar strength of schedule. However, Carpenter's a plus 250 underdog. Nakamura is now a minus 550 favorite, but Muin Gafurov ain't Tagir Ulanbekov. I pretty firmly expect Nakamura. And again, they're fighting on the West Coast too, so they probably want to position this fight a little bit where they're able to get some of the Japanese Asian audience to be able to tune in to watch this one. So this feels like a setup spot for Nakamura here, which is why I think the line is kind of getting steamed the way that it is. Now, you don't just bet a setup spot for the sake of it being a setup spot, because fighters, they still got to go out there and win it. But I think Nakamura has the tools to get Gafurov tired, and as long as he just doesn't get sparked in the first round, he's probably going to drown him to a decision. So that's what I'm expecting. Give me Nakamura to win. I'll say he gets a 30-27. It wouldn't shock me if Gafurov is maybe able to have a moment of impact on the feet in the first round that Nakamura has to kind of survive through the first 5 minutes, and then is able to go, and then goes back to the stool, comes out the second round, and Gafurov's already getting a little bit tired, and Nakamura is able to kind of take over for the final 10 minutes by bringing it to the mat. But give me Nakamura to win a 30-27 in which he pretty much controls this fight, and Gafurov is exhausted before we're even halfway done with it. The next fight is Karol Rosa and Ailin Perez. Rosa enters 18-6. Perez enters 11-2. Rosa last fought at Fight Night Tybura versus Spivac last year, where she got a unanimous decision over a prospect that a lot of people like in Pani Kianzad. Perez, conversely, last fought at Fight Night Moicano Saint-Denis in France, where she submitted Daria Zalesniakova in the first round, and then in one of the most disrespectful post-fight celebrations in recent memory, literally twerked her ass in Zalesniakova's face after submitting her, and all the traditional respect the arts practitioners were up in arms over her disrespecting her opponent like that when it happened. But it was kind of funny, and I'm sure all of her OnlyFans subscribers were overjoyed. Rosa has not finished. She doesn't have any UFC finishes, and granted, Perez didn't have one either prior to drawing Zalesniakova, who apparently has no ground game. And Perez, did not have a submission win since 2018 prior to scoring that one against Zalesniakova. And had a bit of a rep of herself of not really having much of a submission game based on what happened in her UFC debut against Stephanie Egger. Now, here's really the thing that I want to talk about relative to this fight, because if you've been paying close attention on X Twitter this week, there's been some interesting developments that I've drawn a little bit of attention to. So Perez was a plus 155 underdog when I put the pick out. I feel pretty good about her in this spot, just relative to how she's won most of her fights in the UFC, and the fact that she's never lost a decision in her entire MMA career. And again, the only two losses she's had, she took a DQ against Tamiris Vidal, which I believe was a consequence of an illegal knee. I remember looking that up a while ago, but I believe that's why she did lose. I don't know whether she was winning the fight through the first two rounds, because that happened with 2 minutes left in the third round. But in any event, She did lose that one by disqualification, and then got submitted in her UFC debut against Stephanie Egger. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that she hasn't improved since then. As for Rosa, like I said, has only gone the distance in her UFC career. Has been pretty successful doing so, but has traded wins and losses for the last couple of years now. And was giving up takedowns in 2 of those losses, whereas in a lot of the other ones, she wasn't even really being tested with the takedown threat. Now, a lot of people will point to the fact that Sarah McMahon was a much more credentialed wrestler. That was the first UFC fighter to give her a loss than what Ailin Perez has. But I do think that Perez's takedown rate and just volume and efficiency relative to the fact that she's won 3 decisions in the UFC speaks to the fact that even though she's fighting that exhausting style, her cardio holds up fairly decently. I know some people point to the fact that some people thought she was maybe going to get finished in the final round of her fight with Lucy Pudilova, but she still ended up getting the unanimous decision win there. So she was able to effectively win at least the first 2 rounds of that fight before surviving to the end, which is, I don't think it's out of the question she could do the same thing here against Rosa, especially because so much of Rosa's striking success is just rooted in low leg kicks. I can't remember which fight it was. It might have been the Norma Dumont fight that she lost, but I think in that fight she landed something like over like 110 or something significant strikes, and literally 90 of those were low leg kicks. I mean, this is a woman that really, really cheeses on these low leg kicks, like a casual fan would expect Volkanovski to, in certain respects. She's the Marcin Prachnio of the women's bantamweight division, if you want to call her that. So I do think she is being a little bit overvalued here, but there seem to be a lot of people who disagree, because what I was originally going to say, Perez was a plus 155 underdog when I put the pick out, and little over 24 hours later, something kind of funky happened. There's normally not a lot of 100 point. If you see a 100-point jump, it's one thing for there to be gradual line movement that puts a fighter into much significantly bigger range. Like when a line gets blown out from what Rinya Nakamura is a good example that we just talked about. He went from a 400 favorite when I put the pick out to now he's minus 550, but the implied odds between 400 and 550 are not, it's not nearly the difference as when there's a jump between the 100 and the 200 range. Even the difference between 200 and 300 isn't nearly as significant as the difference between 100 and 200, which is why I'm not as perturbed by the fact that Bernardo Sopaj dropped off from being a 350 favorite, losing 70 points of value, to now being only a minus 280 favorite. I don't consider that as suspicious as what happened here with Karol Rosa and Ailin Perez, because in the span of about 2 hours, Karol Rosa went from being a minus, she got all the way out yesterday to something like 360, I think. The line movement that happened was absolutely insane. Perez was, again, I'm recording this on Tuesday night, so yesterday when this happened, Perez was a plus 155 underdog and jumped all the way out to plus 250 2.5 hours later. That's a very suspicious line change, and it happened across pretty much all of the books. And normally when something like that happens that quickly, it's because somebody got a tip that there was an injury and they end up steaming the line. But the thing with Perez is she posts pretty regularly on Instagram. I don't know if the OnlyFans subscribers maybe have some kind of inside scoop that the rest of the public doesn't get access to. But I can't imagine she'd be posting any, allusions to injury on there either. But there's nothing on her Instagram hinting that anything's out of the ordinary in terms of her prep moving up to this fight. In fact, she's got more of a visible presence in terms of fight prep than a lot of fighters that you see on IG. And that's coming from someone that doesn't even really normally go to IG to peruse these things, further than just confirming what camp a fighter is at in the lead up to this stuff. Now there were a couple people in the replies to when I called attention to this on Twitter X that kind of softly hinted at stuff that might be going on. One of them was, you're probably familiar with Andrew Gambas. Gambas didn't really say anything. He just kind of posted a cryptic, deep throat. If you know who Deep Throat is, the American audience in the Richard Nixon lore, kind of the spy jacket or whatever. I don't know. He could just be trolling, which I would guess he probably is. I don't know. I feel like if he had known something, he would have actually hinted, at least on his own account or something, a little bit more. But, I know that people that, claim to be super duper professionals with this probably want to keep their edge. But the thing is, it's like if you've already placed your bets on this, then the cat's kind of out of the bag. If you brag about it after the fact, then you're just kind of a dick. But the other thing that was interesting was Austin Swaim, who works for FanDuel and is also affiliated with Home of Fight, who's been a supporter of MMA Rax for a little bit, gave a tip that he had at least heard that one sharp group of bettors in Vegas had taken a pretty hefty position on Rosa, but not to the point that it would explain this amount of line movement across books this quickly. So something suspicious definitely happened here, and it's going to give me a lot of pause for betting Perez. You're going to want to keep an eye on her at the books, or at the weigh-ins rather, this weekend before actually betting this. I already put the pick out, so I am going to stand by it. I could end up canceling it if she ends up looking like death on the scale or something, if she's not having a good cut. But again, there's nothing out of the ordinary based on what we can tell from her social media presence. So it could just be a wealth of sharp action hitting at once. But, when they say when something is suspicious, watch it. And there's definitely something weird going on here. I'll still say Perez ends up winning a 29-28 decision where she banks the first two rounds and then kind of has to survive to the third after going pretty wrestle heavy on Rosa and being able to hold her down the first two rounds. But again, after all this sharp action, if there's something going on that, the rest of the public isn't really privy to, and Rosa ends up, kind of blowing this one out of the water, wouldn't surprise me at this point. I am spooked by that late movement, but I will be curious to see, especially because Perez is now, more money has come back in on Perez, where now she's not out to being a plus 250 underdog. Now she's back down to like plus 215. Plus money's plus money. So if you've picked an underdog to win, you don't really care about CLV relative to the line getting blown out further. In a lot of cases, if you're confident in your read, you just end up taking a heavier position if you really believe that, if you've really got conviction in your side and that they're going to deliver. So I think she gets it done here. I think she's got a better path to victory than what the market is giving her. But like I said, probably going to want to wait to see how she does on the scale for this one, just because that late movement is pretty sketchy. So we'll see what happens, but I'll take Ailin Perez to win 29-28 and give me my first WMMA money line win, please. Otherwise, I'll be 0 for 2, and it might just be time to go back to doing only the men's fights. I'm kidding. We're too far in the weeds now for that. The next fight is Grant Dawson versus Diego Ferreira. Dawson enters 22-2-1, last fought at Fight Night, Royval versus Tyra against Rafa Garcia. Garcia was a fighter that I had enjoyed a lot, and didn't think his style was going to be a good matchup for Dawson, but at the same time, Dawson was, I think, a pretty expensive favorite for that fight, too expensive for my own taste, especially just given the lack of his ground and pound hadn't proven to be that great in the UFC, mostly for how much of a ground-heavy fighter he was pretty almost exclusively submission-focused. And Garcia had never been finished in his MMA career, so it was alarming that Dawson finished Garcia the way that he did in that fight. I remember making a Minute to Win a breakdown about it where I'm pretty sure I advocated people to just stay away. I had normally been a big advocate of taking overs in Rafa Garcia fights, but I think that was even pretty juiced for that matchup too, so I just said, don't bother with this one. It could get kind of weird. And I'm glad I did, because I very nearly had a sweep on that event until Tyra lost the final round against Royval in what ended up being a split decision. But Dawson is somebody that I have backed with confidence previously. I believe I made him a leg when he fought Mark O'Madsen back in November of 2022. I did take him in that pick'em fight he had with Demir Ismagulov at my sweep of Fight Night Strickland versus Magomedov back in July of 2023. I did take the over on him when he fought Bobby Green, and that bet got blown up within a minute, obviously. And then I believe I advocated for staying away against Joe Selecki just because the value wasn't there. Now the prices come down a little more reasonably because he's fighting a guy in Diego Ferreira who has really, I think, surprised a lot of people in the last two performances. He was favored against Michael Johnson, and his performance against Michael Johnson gets glamorized because of the kind of knockout away. It was pretty similar to that knockout that Cesar Almeida had against Abdul Razak Al Hassan this past weekend. Not only because of the nature of how Johnson went down, like going stiff, but also because Razak Al Hassan was winning that fight due to his own knockdown landed on Almeida before Almeida was able to come back and win that, in the same way that Johnson was winning that fight that most people forget before Ferreira was able to knock out Johnson. And I remember that because I otherwise went perfect on all my picks for Fight Night Dern versus Hill and would have had a sweep there about a month before I actually ended up landing my first sweep of the year back in 2023, but still had a good night overall that night. The fight afterwards, about a year later, he faced Mateusz Rebecki. Rebecki was like a minus 400 favorite. I did make him a parlay leg for that Luis Nascimento, that St. Louis Fight Night event. And Rebecki got knocked down in the first round. Rebecki got a knockdown on Ferreira in the first round. Was looking good, but Ferreira was able to battle back and looked a much fresher fighter when the fight was 1-1 going into the third. And the swelling on Rebecki's face just became too much. He took too much of a beating, and the ref did not allow that to go the distance, which Rebecki would have lost anyway, but it was mercifully stopped in the final 10 seconds, and Ferreira got his second straight win by knockout as a result. Some people have jokingly, in light of USADA's departure, said that Ferreira looked like a new fighter relative to his recent years off of that performance last year. One thing that I do think is interesting about this fight is that I believe Rebecki is at American Top Team, if memory serves correct, or at least has spent time there previously. So I wonder if he still has any sort of connection there to where he would be kind of maybe giving some advice to Grant Dawson in terms of how to approach this upcoming fight. That being said, Dawson is minus 255 here, and that's more playable than he's been in pretty much in any of his last 3 appearances. And I think that I think that's an opportunity that you've really got to capitalize on, just because of how the guy knows where his bread is buttered. It was very fun. I felt very good about his prospects against, or at least the likelihood of the fight going the distance when he fought Bobby Green. Because I remember the way that the face-off that they had, he straight up told Green, like, I'm going to hold you down for 25 minutes. Like, these are the kind of fighters that you love to bet on, where you know exactly how they're going to fight every time. This guy's like the anti-Kevin Holland, if you will, where with Holland, it's kind of a mixed bag and a wild card. With Dawson, the guy knows where his bread is buttered. He knows where his most effective fight is going to be. He doesn't want to entertain Ferreira on the feet at all, and he's going to be trying to get the fight to the ground. The one thing that does give me pause here is that, obviously, as the Michael Johnson win demonstrated, even as Ferreira is going to be turning 40 years old on fight day, he still has one-punch knockout power akin to what Bobby Green used to take advantage of Grant Dawson's chin, which had been cracked before previously, all the way back in 2016 when he lost in 35 seconds to Hugh Pulley. So Dawson really has to avoid just getting power struck here, which, you know, if you took him at, I can't remember what his price was when he fought Bobby Green. I know it had to be probably pretty ridiculous, like something probably close to the minus 400 range. If I look that up right now, he closed a minus 520 against Bobby Green. I mean, get real. If he gets nuked here in the first minute against Ferreira, I mean, it's not great to lose on a fighter that was, you know, minus 225. I mean, it's never great when you bet on a fighter and they get nuked in the first 30 seconds to begin with. That being said, it's more palatable when they're at a minus 250 price tag as opposed to twice as expensive. So I think that Dawson is good value here. I think, you know, this is a guy that has never been submitted in his MMA career. Neither of them have, but you have to imagine that he would have the submission upside here. He's just going to be a little bit more effective on the ground, even though I think Ferreira is pretty good there in his own right and is going to be better on the feet. I think Dawson has shown enough effectiveness against good competition that this is going to be another fighter this is going to be another test that he's able to pass, particularly with Ferreira turning 40 on fight day, Dawson being 30 himself. The trend of fighters or at least fights with a decade-wide age gap going to the younger fighter is pretty well established at this point. I consider age to be the most important variable in the sport, and it's entirely in Dawson's favor in this case, to where I am a little bit surprised. I think the Bobby Green result is probably what's giving people the hesitancy here. And understandably so, given Ferreira's power. But again, that kind of firmly established trend with the decade-wide age gap, Dawson being one of those fighters that consistently fights to his strengths, I think that makes him very, very playable in this range. So I'm pretty confident I'm going to be taking Grant Dawson as a parlay leg this week. I will say that he gets a 30-27 decision that kind of reminds people just how good this guy is. And Ferreira is able to survive whatever submission attempts on the ground. But it wouldn't necessarily surprise me if, particularly with how much Dawson has been trying to do more damage on the ground of late, or at least in wake of the Selecki fight that most people called boring, it wouldn't surprise me if he's able to find a late finish, as he's made a habit of doing earlier in his UFC career. And, you know, even in his most... it wasn't a late finish against Garcia, but, I mean, he's got several third-round finishes on his resume. It wouldn't surprise me if he gets another one here. But give me Grant Dawson I'll say it's a unanimous decision, 30-27. But I don't really see Ferreira winning this fight unless he's able to knock out Dawson in the first round, which could happen. But the longer this goes, the more I like it for Mr. Grant Dawson. The next fight is Jailton Almeida and Serghei Spivac. Almeida is 21-3 and last fought at UFC 302 last June against Alexander Romanov. He submitted him in the first round. Almeida was about only 300 price tag for that fight. I felt very, very good about him getting that first round finish. I made him a parlay leg and he delivered. Was coming off of his only UFC loss prior to that against Curtis Blaydes, where he really dominated Blaydes in the first round, but then made an egregiously bad error in the second round of not protecting his head while too committed to, I think it was a single leg. I don't think it was a double leg, but he was too committed to holding onto the leg when he had Blaydes against the fence and Blaydes started raining down the elbows from the clinch, or maybe it was hammer fist, but it was one of those very, very rare finishes that you see in in a fence clinch, and it was entirely the product of Almeida just making a dumb decision to not protect his head, and Blaydes was able to get the knockout after getting dominated in the first round. So Almeida's still kind of looking to bounce back a bit, especially given Romanov has been cut from the UFC, which is BS. When was the last time a ranked fighter got cut off of a win that didn't retire afterwards? Justice for Romanov, one of the best athletes in the UFC, at least for his body type. Conversely, Serghei Spivac enters 17-4, last won in his main event back in August against Marcin Tybura, where I think he got a takedown but then got reversed. Tybura ended up on top, and Spivac was able to get an armbar from his back, which you do not see at heavyweight every day. So kudos to Spivac for that one. He had been on the shelf for quite a bit prior to that after getting pieced up by Cyril Gane in the main event for Fight Night France back in 2023. I'll make this one quick. Almeida's -5. He's minus 430. I mean, that's ridiculous. Even the best thing that could happen in this fight is that it doesn't go to the ground at all, and we get to see how comfortable Almeida is striking against a guy that isn't necessarily comfortable with his own striking in Spivac either. But unfortunately, I can't imagine either one of these guys is going to want to prove a point. They're probably just going to want to fight to their strengths. And I think that you just have to look at the natural athlete that Almeida is relative to, well, I don't know if natural is the right word, but the kind of physique and athleticism that Almeida has relative to the guy that Spivac came into the UFC as and kind of had to gradually build himself into. Spivac is extremely strong. I mean, if you watch the Derek Lewis fight, you know that. At the same time, if you watched Almeida fight Derek Lewis, you know how strong Almeida is too. And I don't think that Spivac could fight the kind of game plan that Almeida did against Curtis Blaydes and, get like 10 takedowns in the first round and consistently get mat returns. I don't know if Spivac has the kind of just raw strength to be able to do that, even though we've seen him ragdoll guys like Greg Hardy before. So my immediate reaction looking at this fight was, okay, I can't bet Almeida at this price. And, the numbers tell me it's closer than I think it's going to be, but I don't think I would even bother betting Almeida in the 200 range for this. But this is a heavyweight fight. And I've long made the joke that heavyweight unders feed families in this economy, particularly when they're at plus odds. So the last one I took as an example was in Czech Wu versus Brzezinski, and Kennedy finished him in the first round. And that was when Kennedy was like a 500 favorite, probably even more than that at close. So when I was evaluating this fight, I was surprised to see the under 1.5 was available at plus 125. I thought, great. Plus odds on a heavyweight under. That is easy pick. Boom. Done. 24 hours later, when the pick was supposed to go out, or maybe a day before the pick was supposed to go out, that had become about a pick'em, and I thought, oh, great, I just lost my plus odds play. Well, okay, whatever. A little bit more juice came back in on the over. Now it's available minus 105. When it goes out, I can put it in minus 105. It's still technically an underdog pick. I'll live with that and feel good with it. It's still, like pick'em underdog, if you will. Now, as I'm looking at it tonight, the under has flipped to being the favored outcome, and the under 1.5 is now minus 125 and dropping. So, feel pretty good about that being the sharp play. It is getting a little bit juicy for what I would prefer to play it at. Honestly, I think if it gets out any worse than this, it's probably just better to just stay away from this entirely, because it is very possible that this ends up being just kind of a, even if Almeida ends up getting Spivac down, which is what I expect to happen, Spivac has enough grappling acumen to kind of defend himself long enough to where this fight gets dragged out into the second half before Almeida is able to submit him. Maybe in the second half of the second round, which is similar to what happened when Almeida fought Shamil Abdurakhimov. So I like this a lot more when it was an underdog play. Now that the plus money is gone on it, I would exercise caution in terms of how much chalk you want to eat on betting this. Like I said, if this does get out any further, I would just stay away. But I am going to say Almeida submits Spivac in the first round, gets him done. Spivac is just, I think he's not going to react well to getting uncharacteristically ragdolled the way that Almeida is probably going to. And Almeida is a guy that, similar to Grant Dawson, he knows where his bread is buttered. He knows how he wants to fight these guys. The big reason that he moved up to heavyweight from light heavyweight is because he recognized that so many of the fighters in this division don't have the kind of ground game that he's already got built in. Now, the risk that he runs with that is that he doesn't really have the striking to compete with any of the top level talent. But because of that, he knows this is a fight that he doesn't really want to entertain ever on the feet, regardless of who the opponent is. And I don't think that Spivac has enough comfort on the ground that I think he's probably going to end up sitting and entertaining that when it goes there, as opposed to trying to duke this out on the feet. So give me Jailton Almeida to win by first round submission. I believe that would be the first submission loss of Serghei Spivac's career. But again, I think Spivac too, and a similar reason to why Almeida decided to move up to heavyweight, I think a lot of Spivac's own success has been built on the fact that there's just not a lot of heavyweights that have the kind of grappling and ground game acumen and ability that Spivac has, I don't want to say coasted on, but has at least made his calling card during his run into main event status and into the upper parts of the UFC heavyweight rankings. So him not being as accustomed to fighting guys that can give him resistance in his most effective area. You could say the same thing for Almeida, but you would also be hard-pressed to argue that Almeida doesn't have the athleticism advantage here, which is why he's going to be able to more easily implement his game plan than what Spivac would want to do. So give me Almeida to win by first-round sub. The next fight is Payton Talbott and Raoni Barcelos. Talbott's 9-0, knocked out Giannis Gamori at UFC 303, which was one of my best events last year. But Talbott was unplayable at pretty much the same price that he is right now. But one of the rare instances where a fighter performs to price. I think that he perfect gamed Gamori. I don't even think Gamori landed single strike. Gamori landed one of two significant strikes, so he did get one in, but he also got totally nuked. And yes, Talbott did close at minus 1,300 for that. One of the rare performances to price at that range. Conversely, Raoni Barcelos enters 18-5. I've had a pretty good run capping his career in the UFC. I don't remember how I probably took the plus 2.5 rounds when he fought Trevin Jones. But I don't totally recall what my read for that fight was, but I'm pretty sure that's what I ended up going with. That was back in October of 2022. However, I have very accurately read his last 3 fights where he fought Umar Nurmagomedov. You couldn't take Umar at the ridiculous price that he was at. So I took the under in that fight at plus money, and Umar gave Barcelos the first knockout of his MMA career. And frankly, it was something we hadn't seen from Umar before in terms of scary one-punch power. Like, that was the most eye-opening performance out of all the ones Nurmagomedov has had in the UFC before. I know Barcelos was, I think, 36 when that happened, but still, I mean, that was literally, well, it might have been 35. But that was still the first time he had ever been knocked out in his MMA career. And it came on not from a guy that was really known for his kicks, or a guy that was known for his kicks more than the power he had in his hands. And when he knocked him out like that, a guy that had never been knocked out before, I was like, okay, I already knew the hype on this guy was real, if for no other reason than the ties to Khabib and Father's Plan. But that opened my eyes more than anything else relative to Umar, but we'll talk about him a little bit later. Faded Barcelos against Kyler Phillips. I obviously had very good opinion of Kyler Phillips. That ended up costing me pretty badly down the stretch of last year against Rob Font. But I was confident he was going to handle Barcelos, and he did. Although I think some people would argue that he lost the last round, and I think he did on at least one scorecard in that instance. But it's neither here or there. Phillips was, I think, something like a 250, 350, maybe 220 favorite in that fight, and I felt good making him a parlay leg, and he delivered. And then Barcelos was an underdog against Christian Quinones for reasons that kind of eluded me. Quinones hadn't really beaten any super quality comp in the UFC yet, and I was surprised. I thought people were just kind of blindly betting on the age gap in that case and giving Quinones the benefit of the doubt, and Barcelos ended up turning the tables as that fight went on and was able to get the second submission win of his UFC career and the first one since he tapped out Chris Gutierrez in the fight after his UFC debut. And it was only the third submission win of his entire MMA career at that point. So this is a step up in competition for Talbott. Not enormously so, but again, I mean, this is another case where it's a decade-wide age gap, and you would really expect Talbott to deliver. Now, I would pretty confidently bet Talbott like in the 300 range. I don't even think I think he opened as like a 900 favorite. Like, I would be surprised if he opened at any other book any lower than the 9. So at DraftKings he was 600 at open, but at like FanDuel he was minus 1100 at open. I mean, these are some of the most ridiculous opening prices I've ever seen in the time I've been doing this, frankly. So there was never really a realistic opportunity to bet Talbott as the favorite here. Hopefully at some point he gets matched up with I know they probably, I mean, the potential star status for this guy is enormous, so you would think the UFC wants to kind of slowly bring him along and give him appropriate levels up in competition. But speaking selfishly as a bettor, we want to get a playable price on this guy, something similar to what he had against Cameron Simon, in fairly short order. I'll say too, I like the fact that so many of his finishes prior to the last one, prior to the Gamori fight, Talbott didn't have a single finish in the first round in his entire MMA career. That, he's clearly getting better with each fight and therefore more dangerous, and so more first-round finishes are probably in store going forward. But the fact that he has proven to be kind of a builder that ends up finishing off fights as they get deeper, and he's able to build on the work that he's done and the damage that he's dealt, I think has to give you a little bit of pause here relative to betting what is lined as a minus or a over-under of 1.5, I think is the standard for most of these books. Because Barcelos, outside of that Nurmagomedov fight, has proven to be pretty durable in his MMA career, and he's only been submitted once, and that was all the way back in 2014. And I've made the point on here many times before about how as fighters get older, the one thing that tends to consistently improve is their submission defense. And Talbott's only got one win by submission, and it was him kind of proving a point of his development when he fought Nick Aguirre, who was, not really UFC caliber and totally out of his element in that matchup. So, if you're going to bet a prop here, it's probably Talbott by KO. I would imagine that's totally juiced in its own right, which it is. I mean, Talbott wins inside the distance is minus 260. Talbott wins by KO is minus 190. So that's not bad. I mean, you could do much worse than that. But it really wouldn't surprise me if this ends up going the distance for the second time in Talbott's career, just because Barcelos is crafty enough where he could drag this out to a decision, as he has in so many of his other UFC appearances against guys that are, fairly talented in their own right, like Kyler Phillips or like Said Nurmagomedov. But guys like if you're thinking Talbott's got more of a ceiling like Umar's than some of those other guys, which it's kind of looking like he does at this point, it's not out of the question that he ends up knocking him out. Honestly, I would think this goes to decision if I hadn't seen how brutal the Gamori knockout was. I mean, he proved that he's got that one-punch power already at 26 years old after that. Given the other recently lethal performances he's had, particularly that Simon fight, where he's really proven to be kind of an 8-tool striker, I have no problem if you want to take him to knock out Barcelos here, and honestly, I can see it happening. I don't think it'll be a first-round finish. I'll say that he knocks out Barcelos in the second round. So give me Talbott to win by second-round knockout, but again, you should just pretty much stay away from this one entirely, just given what the state of the money line is and the fact that so many of Talbott's finishes tend to happen outside of the first round, and Barcelos has only been knocked out once. I would just stay away from this one and enjoy the fireworks whenever they happen. The main card of UFC 311 starts off with Reinier de Ridder and Kevin Trailblazer Holland. De Ridder enters 18-2, made his UFC debut at Fight Night Magny Prates against Gerald Meerschaert, where some people were expecting De Ridder to, if he was going to win, which he was favored to do, I believe, it was going to happen in the early stages of the fight. Otherwise, Meerschaert was going to do what Meerschaert always does and come back later and get the submission win. It ended up being the total inverse. Meerschaert looked better earlier in that fight, and then De Ridder kind of settled in and was able to turn the tables and eventually finished Meerschaert in the third round. But some people weren't as encouraged by the performance, and 34 is a pretty late age to be making your UFC debut, even after you've had as much success as you did against one. But especially debuting down a weight class from what you were fighting in your previous promotion where you enjoyed all your success, it is a bit of an interesting move. Speaking of moving weight classes, Holland keeps jumping back and forth between welterweight and middleweight, but we all know the middleweight experiment has been less than encouraging for Trailblazer. He's coming off a performance against Roman Dolidze in which he was, I believe, slightly favored to win, and was doing great work on the feet, but ended up, I think, getting taken down after Dolidze was given no other option. And in an unfortunate circumstance during a scramble, I think popped out a rib, and the fight had to get stopped between rounds because it was evident that Holland wasn't going to be able to continue in the state of pain he was in. So it was unfortunate. All the people that bet Dolidze were telling you, oh, Dolidze forced that injury, so it was a legitimate KO, and, if you bet Holland, it was stupid bad bet. And it's like, how else do you expect a Holland fight to go other than getting some weird shit like that? It is what it is. I feel more comfortable with taking Holland here, mainly because of what the price tag is. I mean, this has been a pick'em basically all week. Holland's been the underdog at various points. When I put the pick out, he was the underdog again. In fights like this where, the reads are so, I shouldn't say the reads, but both sides of the market are so convinced that their side is going to be the one to win. Normally, I just end up looking at, especially when it's a pick'em in what figures to be a striker versus grappler matchup, which guy is able to give more resistance to the other side's area of strength? Kevin Holland, although he has been submitted multiple times in the UFC, I believe in the UFC, yeah, he's been submitted twice in the UFC to Brendan Allen and to Khamzat Chimaev, who are both middleweights. But Holland, who has been submitted multiple times at middleweight in the UFC, still has 9 submission wins of his own on his record, is a very credentialed Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner in his own right. Had some interesting scrambles, frankly, even against somebody like Khamzat Chimaev that still mauled him. And, he wasn't prepping to fight Chimaev. He just was willing to take that fight on short notice, given the shuffle that ended up happening with Chimaev blowing weight on that card and them trying to keep Nate Diaz on it to finish out his contract. But in any event, De Ridder is not anywhere close to the striker that Holland is, relative to Holland having at least, a little bit more capability on the ground compared to what De Ridder can do, relative to what De Ridder can do on the feet against Kevin Holland's own ability. And I know it was kind of a similar thing with Roman Dolidze, but Dolidze was someone who had a lot more UFC experience and was, frankly, I think a better athlete than who Reinier De Ridder is. And Dolidze was also someone who I think, frankly, I mean, you could say what you want about who De Ridder has fought at one, but at the end of the day, the UFC is the top promotion in the world for the reason. And that's, you really should be valuing UFC experience more heavily than whoever the guys are that De Ridder is fighting at one, even up a weight class. So it wouldn't surprise me if De Ridder's able to get takedowns early and Holland's not able to get up and he just gets held down the way that he has in a lot of these middleweight fights, and he avoids getting finished, but he's also not really able to tee off strikes. But again, in these close fights that, you've got a two, if not necessarily striker versus grappler matchup, given how well-rounded Holland is, at least two guys where their presumed paths to victory are in completely different worlds, I'm typically going to go with the side that is the more well-rounded one, and that's Kevin Holland, and he's at the better value price than what De Ridder has been for most of the week. So De Ridder has been knocked out he was undefeated prior to facing Anatoly Malikin. Forgive me. There's going to be people like, oh my God, he doesn't watch one. He's telling on himself that he can't pronounce that name, whatever. I know some people have talked about that guy being a little bit of a Roy junkie, and that being, I think the second fight, some people were saying it was at heavyweight even. So yeah, De Ridder, I know he's fighting someone at middleweight now, not necessarily light heavyweight or heavyweight. But again, that's just weight coming off of his chin. That's him having been knocked out at higher weight classes. If he gets caught with having less weight on him and having worse damage resistance against a guy in Holland who we've seen the guy have absolute freakish knockouts from even his back, like when he fought Jacare Souza, and then obviously being a very good kicker as well. I think that Holland's very live for a knockout here. So I'll say that's how he gets it done. Give me Kevin Holland to win by first round knockout. And I'll say that he gets it done with a punch. The next fight is Renato Moicano and Beneil Dariush. Moicano enters 25-1 off of one of the more surprising, I think, upsets of 2024, frankly, even if the line didn't necessarily indicate. He was still a pretty hefty underdog. But yeah, got the win over Benoit Saint-Denis at UFC France. I think that's probably what made him more surprising, was the fact that he was able to beat Saint-Denis in his own backyard. And frankly dominated that fight. There was speculation that if the fight didn't get stopped due to doctor stoppage, that Saint-Denis was starting to build a little bit and Moicano was kind of slowing down, but Moicano just jumped all over him in that first round so badly to the point where it was like, yeah, I totally understand why that fight ended up getting stopped the way it did. For Moicano's second knockout win of his MMA career after getting his first one against Jailton Turner, in a fight where he got knocked down at the end of the first round. If Turner had been more proactive in finishing the fight, probably could have gotten a finish at the end of the first round there, but tried to get a knockoff. Ref didn't give it to him. Moicano survived to the bell. Turner was a little bit disheartened. Moicano was able to turn the tables in the second round and ended up ground and pounding out Turner for the first knockout win of his MMA career. Conversely, Dariush has not fought since getting thwacked by Arman Tsarukyan at UFC Fight Night. Dariush Tsarukyan in what was, I believe, it was the first event of December of 2023, so not quite the last event of the year. I believe that was actually UFC 296, and there might have been one other fight night wedged between there, but one of the last events of the year nonetheless, and we haven't seen Dariush since. This is a very tough call because neither of these guys have great damage tolerance, and there's so many similarities between the two of them. Like their striking efficiency relative to both how accurate they are and how the percentage of incoming blows that they're able to block is nearly the same. I believe Moicano is an inch taller, which isn't significant, particularly when you consider the fact that their reach is identical. I believe they're both 72-inch reach. And on top of that, they're the same age. I think they average almost the same rate of takedowns. They have the same amount of finishes in the UFC. They have the same amount of fights in their MMA careers that have gone the distance. And they have pretty much the same rate of winning fights that go the distance in their MMA careers. Very, very, very similar fighters in many respects. But Moicano's also been somebody who, the thing that I would like to say, or the thing that I like to say about him for a while, was that he's probably the best striker in MMA that doesn't have any knockout wins. So I do think that he's more capable in that area than he was getting credit for up until, late last year. And it's not like he beat Turner because of the success he had on the feet. That was, him getting the ground and pound win. Against Saint-Denis, he was a little bit better in that regard, but it was still a lot of what he was doing in terms of ground and pound with like elbows and stuff. I mean, the guy has ferocious offense on the ground. Dariush, obviously a very decorated grappler, and is probably going to be able to put up more resistance there than Moicano is used to facing, I think, or at least has faced recently. Even though I think Jailton Turner's a good grappler in his own right. But I do think Dariush, the thing that is making this line close and gives me a little bit of pause in terms of just saying outright Moicano's going to win, is he's definitely the guy that, since Moicano, both of his knockouts have been ground and pound affairs, or one was a doctor stoppage that was fueled by ground and pound. He clearly does not have that one punch lights out power. And we've seen Dariush really, really hurt guys with that. So, two guys that have bad damage tolerance, Dariush is definitely the heavier hitter of the two. Even if you consider Moicano the more technical striker, which I don't necessarily think is the case. I think that they're pretty even on the feet, power notwithstanding. The power is what makes me kind of give Dariush the edge in that area. I can see why so many people are eager to bet Dariush in this spot. However, most people that are betting Moicano are doing it on the basis that he's got the better momentum in his career, which, I think is a very valid point, and it is one reason I'm confident relative to these guys being the same age. One guy's coming off of 2 losses that were not good for his attrition after already having a bad chin that had been compromised by the likes of Alexander Hernandez earlier in his MMA career. You compare that to Moicano, who last year probably got the 2 biggest wins of his MMA career outright. And also beat Drew Dober last year in what was a great fight very early on in the year. So had a great 2024, has a lot of great momentum. I think probably at this point, there's a I don't know if it's a rumor, if it's been confirmed or not, but some people like to joke about the fact that Dariush really tried to heavily leverage his star power, or star power if you want to call it that, in terms of like getting a title shot or a new contract with the UFC or whatever, and the brass just kind of like laughed at him in terms of like, you're operating on a totally different reality. You compare that to Moicano, who's been called the best, post-fight interview in the sport right now, or at this point. He's always cutting great promos after the fight. Just won his first main event, I believe. The only other main event I think he had on his resume prior to this was when he fought Korean Zombie a couple hours away from where I'm at now in South Carolina, and got knocked out in what was one of the biggest highlights of Chan Sung Jun's MMA career. So was able to bounce back and get the win in his second main event, and has a lot of great momentum in his career right now. If the layoffs were consistent here, I would probably take Dariush, because all things considered, where most of the variables here are pretty consistent with each other, power is such a difference maker, and given the fact that both of these guys have had their chins taken from them early in fights before, it's hard to ignore Dariush being able to come up with that again. And these guys both come from great camps. Renato, a top team, Dariush at King's MMA. And that makes me curious as well how the crowd is going, which side the crowd's going to support here, because obviously Moicano is a fan favorite right now, but Dariush is one of the few guys, even though he is technically born in Iran, he is a longtime California guy, trains out of King's MMA, and is one of the few fighters with explicit California ties on this card. I did forget to mention that about Kevin Holland. I know that he lives in Texas now, but he is a guy that was, I believe, born in California, and so I do expect the crowd to be more firmly on his side than I do for Reinier de Redder. But him and Dariush are 2 of the really only guys on this card that have kind of, some sort of life ties to California, which I think is interesting relative to who the crowd is going to want to support. So I'll be curious to see which way they swing in this fight. I would think that they probably end up leaning. I would think they're probably going to support just a good fight, that they're not going to be on one side or the other. And so the bigger thing that this comes down to for me is the difference in ring rust. Dariush has not fought for over a year. Moicano, at the end of September, had arguably the most impressive win of his UFC career. That was 4 months ago. That's 3 times as short of a layoff as what Dariush is dealing with. In a fight where so many of the variables are consistent, I think that big discrepancy in ring rust is enough to offset the power advantage Dariush would have, just enough that I think I'm going to be taking Renato Moicano to get it done here. Dariush, I don't believe, has ever been submitted. He's been submitted once. That was by Michael Chiesa all the way back in 2016. I know a lot of people are expecting violence in this fight. I think this fight has good fight of the night potential, even though it's probably going to end up being one of the main events that they give it to. But I think, even though I think Moicano wins, it's tough for me to say it's going to be a club and sub. If the attrition on Dariush is really, really bad, I think it probably ends up being a club and sub. But at the same time, it wouldn't shock me to see this go the distance. I do think it's going to be a close fight. I'll say Moicano wins the first 2 rounds, and then Dariush is able to kind of hurt him late, and Moicano just kind of has to survive to a decision, but ends up doing it and gets a 29-28 win. So give me Renato Moicano to win by unanimous decision in what is a very close fight, potential fight of the night contender. I do think Dariush has the knockout upside here, but I think both guys have fairly decent submission upside. Probably give it just a little bit more to Moicano because he really, really has just been such a brutalizer on the ground of late, where I don't think even though I think Dariush is good on the ground, I don't think he's been as nearly as brutal of a ground violence guy of late or in his career as Moicano has. So give me Renato Moicano to win 29-28, where he banks the first 2 rounds. The featured bout on the main card for UFC 311 is Jamal Hill and Yuri Prochazka. Free content opportunity if you're Alex Pereira's social media managers. Assuming he isn't going to be attending this event, or even if he is, as long as he's with his family, have his sons sitting on either side of him, whether they're watching at home on the couch or in person in the stands, and take a picture from behind them with all 3 of them looking into the ring as this fight is going on, with the caption from Pereira that says, "Watching my sons fight with watching my sons fight with my sons." I know I kind of butchered that joke a little bit, but again, I would think that Pereira is going to be watching this one with a rare smile on his face, knowing that he took the chins off of both of these guys the 3 times that he had to fight the 2 of them. Hill enters 12-2, hasn't fought since Pereira beat him last year at UFC 300. A lot of people were saying, "Oh my goodness, like how is the main event possibly going to live up to what just happened in the Holloway Gaethje fight?" And you know what? I think it's pretty hard to get any cooler of a result than when, you get kicked in the nuts without breaking gaze. You wave off the timeout from the official, and then on pretty much your very next strike, you end up dropping your opponent. So I was pretty confident Pereira was going to beat these guys all 3 times that he fought them, and he did. I think Hill had some decent success in that first round, but nothing that totally brought Pereira out of his element. And clearly, I mean, you saw the difference in the power Pereira has relative to everybody else, because Hill had never actually been knocked out like that. Obviously had the injury TKO to Paul Craig when they fought in 2021, but had never been outright knocked out cold like that. Does Hill have a little bit of an argument that, like, oh, it was, I thought there was going to be a stoppage, and so I wasn't, or a timeout of sorts, and I wasn't really, mentally in the zone when I got knocked? I mean, yeah, I kind of get it, but it's like if I got knocked out, I would probably say the similar thing. And also, if you don't want to accidentally put yourself into that state of mind, don't kick the guy in the nuts and give the ref a reason to stop the fight. Like, did you kick him in the nuts expecting there would be a stoppage? Like, trying to purposely get one? Like, come on. But I can understand where he's coming from, at least with that argument. Conversely, Prochazka is 35-1. I don't remember how short notice it was, but I know that after the McGregor Chandler fight fell through, the 303 kind of had to scramble to get another main event, and that I think they were supposed to rematch at UFC. Was 307 the one that was in Sydney, or maybe it was 304? I think it was 305, actually, the one that was in Australia. The rumor was they were supposed to rematch at that one. They expedited this, probably gave them a little bit of a pay bump to do so. And Ferreira looked so much better in this one than he did in the first one against Yuri. Yuri wasn't able to have any of the takedown success that he did in the first one. Nearly got finished at the end of the first round. And then, for my money, what was the best finish in a title fight last year, Pereira comes out of the corner in the second round and just kicks Yuri's head off. So Yuri's had some rough attrition of late. Granted, it's all been from the same guy, but it's been from championship. It's been from a champion level fighter in two of his last three fights. And, frankly, he was losing that fight against Teixeira too, even though I don't think Teixeira ever had him hurt the way that Pereira did. He was still losing that fight up until he pulled the submission out with 30 seconds remaining in the fifth round in what was one of the best fights of 2022. But still, most people would tell you that Yuri was on his way to losing that fight with Glover. So I think that's something to consider here, is that he could very well be 0 for 3 in title fights in the UFC. And frankly, I picked Rakic to beat him, and Rakic won that first round and was winning the second round up until Yuri just kind of went, warrior mode and just kept marching on him. And that, I've seen that's the reason why people are making this fight a pick'em now, is because they're like, oh, have you seen that one clip that is a meme on social media of Hill's drop foot or whatever? His footwork is so bad. If Hill's footwork was really that bad, frankly, he would not have made it to this point where he would, be a former UFC champion. I'm sorry, you don't get to champion. You cannot name a single champion in UFC history, regardless of weight class, that has bad footwork. You can't. I'm sorry, you just can't. That is... For being a high-level athlete in any sport, having good footwork is a baseline requirement. And it's the first thing that I look at in terms of how good a UFC fighter is. If you are UFC caliber, your footwork is it's at least average, if not better than that. And that's what I would say is the case for Hill. I would actually say it's fairly solid outside of that one clip that everybody likes to harken on. I think he gets a bad rep, and that people, just because he's kind of made himself a villain relative to Pereira, people just like to overly hate on the guy more than he kind of deserves, frankly. But an example of a guy that has bad footwork, I would say, what was that guy's name that lost to? He was a heavyweight. I think his name was it was Alan. It was the French guy named Alan something. He had really bad footwork. Another Alan that had bad footwork was Alen Amadovsky, who washed out of the middleweight division fairly quickly. But bad footwork is rare for not just the UFC level, but it's almost non-existent for championship level fighters. So I don't agree with this narrative that Hill's not going to be able to handle a pressure striker like Yuri. My counter for that is that if Yuri's a pressure striker, I mean, Hill's proven to be a very capable just striker generally. Yuri's striking differential at this point is negative, and he doesn't check leg kicks. He's a very defensively reckless and irresponsible fighter. And so he can pressure as much as he wants to, but against very high-level competition like the one he's going to be facing in featured bouts or that have been former or active champions in this sport, he's probably going to get countered. And that's basically what I expect to happen here. I think it's possible that it's a little bit tentative to start as the two of them are feeling each other out, but even in those moments, Hill's proven to be a little bit more active, and as Yuri starts to try to kind of force the issue and feels himself getting hurt, Hill's already made enough reads by that point where he's able to counter effectively, and the attrition at this point, even with both guys coming off of knockouts that happened last year, you can't deny based on the fact that Yuri had been knocked out multiple times in the first round of fights, even prior to getting to the UFC, that the both recent and long-term attrition for Yuri's chin is worse than what Hill is coming off of. Both guys have proven they can get sparked, but Prochazka has been sparked more. And against a guy that has the kind of power that Hill does, I don't see this ending any other way, frankly. The numbers love Hill here. When I look at like doing a little bit more technical analysis, I see why this fight is lined as a pick'em, because I do think Yuri is proven to be just slightly a little bit more well-rounded than what we've seen from Hill. But at the end of the day, I look at the attrition relative to the output that Hill has, and I just don't see this fight ending any other way other than Hill getting the knockout here from Yuri, forcing the issue and just getting countered and put down bad. So I'm going to be taking Hill to get a late first round knockout here, and I feel pretty good about it. With so many of the fights being like in the 200 range on this card, there's probably at least one leg that I'm going to have to lean on a little bit more than I would like to, that's down closer to the pick'em range. It's not going to be Kevin Holland, but I don't want to make Hill a parlay leg, but it very well may come to that relative to the other legs that I have to sprinkle on in accordance with that relative to what other value that they have. So ideally I would like to put together some combination of, Grant Dawson and Bernardo Sopaj, assuming he holds below that 300 range. And then, we'll talk about what my picks for the main event are in a bit, or coming up. Where I don't have to include a fight that's a pick'em in terms of a parlay, and the Moicano fight is close enough where even though he's at 170, I would rather not hinge my profit for the evening on that, given the potential that I do see for Dariush in that fight. I feel much more confident betting against Prochazka, especially given the recent success I've had for it, than I do betting against Dariush. Especially because I took Mateusz Gamrot against Dariush a couple of years ago. But I also took Rakic against Yuri. So it's come back to bite me in both cases. But still had more success fading Prochazka. Feel like I have a better read on who he is than I did against Dariush previously. So we'll see how it shakes out. But at the end of the day, relative to what I elect to choose for parlay legs. But at the end of the day, still expect Hill to get the knockout here. Maybe it happens a little bit later than I said. maybe it's a similar situation, the Ferreira fight, where Hill has him hurt at the end of the first round, but Yuri's able to go back to the corner. They come out of the corner. Yuri's still compromised, and Hill's able to finish him from there in the second round. But I expect the attrition to build up pretty quickly here, and for Hill to get a knockout in what would probably set up a rematch from UFC 300 for Hill versus Ferreira, assuming Ferreira doesn't go heavyweight hunting. The co-main event at UFC 311 is a bantamweight title fight between Merab Dvalishvili and Umar Nurmagomedov. Cousin Umar is 18-0, coming off of, after getting heavily criticized for, he ain't fought nobody while he's been in the UFC, frankly, totally dismantling Corey Sandhagen at UFC Abu Dhabi back last August. Sandhagen was somebody who, frankly, I think the UFC was protecting Sean O'Malley from during his own reign as champion. Unfortunately, they could not protect him from Merab Dvalishvili, who was at various points, I think, the underdog and the favorite against O'Malley when they fought in September. I remember breaking down that fight, talking about how both Merab and O'Malley were anomalous relative to their areas of strength compared to the average UFC fighter in the breakdown I gave for the RAXPOD on UFC 306. O'Malley was almost twice as active in terms of volume and far more accurate as a striker, and Merab was averaging about 4 times more takedowns than the average UFC fighter per 15 minutes. So I went with the striker there just because every round starts on the feet. O'Malley was close, I think closer than a lot of people want to give credit for. I do think that 48-47 for Merab was the appropriate score there. I was kind of holding out hope that the UFC was going to do a little bit of a screw job in Vegas just to protect their cash cow, but they ended up letting it go, and they gave Merab his belt, and now we're at the point where a decision machine is champion, and a guy that, I mean, look, I can understand why, like, probably casual fans aren't super jazzed on watching this guy fight, but, you know, you watch as many fights as I have in the process of doing this, and you take a liking, you know, to just seeing guys that are able to implement their game plan consistently. I really just, the thing that I love about particularly the high level part of this sport is just when it turns into violent chess. You know, obviously what we want to see is a first round finish in pretty much every fight if we could, but once the fighters have passed the point where that's no longer possible, what you end up seeing is really just at least between two high-level athletes, is a technical-based tit-for-tat strategy game in terms of which one of us is more well-rounded and which one of us is going to be able to implement a more optimal game plan. Dvalishvili totally dedicating himself to just being a pressure wrestler, grappler that, you know, frankly doesn't really do a good job of landing ground and pound, but has built up his striking enough to the point where it's a good enough placeholder for setting up his takedown attempts to where, all right, once I've got the distance closed, I'm just not going to ever give you any space. And you're going to get put on the fence at the very least, if not taken down, and you're going to lose the round because I'm just going to get stuck to you and not let go. Which is exactly what happened against Sean O'Malley. It's what happened for the last 10 minutes against Cejudo. It's what opened a lot of eyes for people against Peter Yan when Dvalishvili went 16 for 48 on takedowns. It even happened against Jose Aldo, despite the fact that Dvalishvili landed no takedowns in that fight. He was still able to wall install Aldo to a 30-27 decision. It's very interesting in hindsight that Merab gets forgiven for that, whereas a guy like Mario Batista gets absolutely vilified, which I made a joke about earlier this week relative to what Bruno Lopez did to Magomed Gaziazulov as well. Apparently, if you're walling and stalling against a guy named Magomed or any other Dagestani, you're celebrated as a hero. But if you dare do it against the King of Rio, you're a terrible person unless you make funny social media videos like Merab does. In any event, Merab's only UFC finish was against a guy in Marlon Moraes, was fading pretty fast at that point in his career, and who in the early stages of that fight very nearly finished Merab himself. So there is, despite the fact that Merab's never been knocked out, there is some chin concern here for him that makes me fairly optimistic about the variety of ways that Umar Nurmagomedov can win this fight. I do think that Merab is going to have the cardio advantage here, which Umar's probably not accustomed to having another fighter have over him. That being said, I mean, Umar's cardio looked phenomenal against Sandhagen. I think arguably his most effective round in that fight was the 5th round that he had. But I would still expect that if Umar does win this fight by decision, it's probably because he banks the first 3 rounds, at least the first 2, maybe wins one of the last 3 that isn't, if it doesn't end up being the first 3 straight rounds. But Merab, just kind of committed to his style and still building and having enough left in the tank, is able to take the last 2. And it's what really makes me concerned here for betting against Merab, because I do think that in the 300 range, Umar Nurmagomedov is playable. But my history of betting against Dvalishvili, even though I've really only done it in the O'Malley fight, is not great. I did have Jan, I believe, graded to beat Merab, and instead I opted to take the plus 4.5 rounds juiced for that fight, and it ended up going the distance, and it was the right call. I took the plus 2.5 rounds against Jose Aldo. It was the right call. I took the plus 2.5 rounds against Henry Cejudo and made that a parlay leg for my my sweep at UFC 298, and that was also the right call. And then I finally tried betting against him, riding Sean O'Malley, who had been a very profitable fighter for me up to that point. And it was not the right call, even though, like I said, I think that fight was closer than people that took Merab and really don't like O'Malley would want you to remember. So in cases of where one guy is obviously a decision machine, you should just be betting on fights to go the distance. Now, the unique thing here relative to Merab is that I don't know how many of these strikers that he's faced have really had the potential to kind of put his lights out since he fought Marlon Moraes. Sean O'Malley did, which is one of the reasons why I picked O'Malley to beat him. But O'Malley never really got the opportunity, in spite of how prolific he is as an offensive UFC fighter, to land any shots that really compromised him up until he kind of got hurt to the body in the 5th round. But again, that was more of a body shot. That wasn't like him getting clipped on the chin or anything. The concern I have with picking the over in this fight, which is at slightly better value than what Umar's money line is, but is getting close to similar range now that Umar's coming down to the edge of minus 300, is Umar catching Merab with like a question mark kick or some kind of knee up the middle when Merab is shooting a takedown. And the power in his hands that he demonstrated against Raoni Barcelos that I alluded to earlier. I think all of the finishing upside here is on Umar's side, which is why I think he's part of the reason that he's the favorite that he is. I do think that there's some truth to the fact that people are just, steaming the father's plan angle on this card relative to both Makhachev and Umar, which is why the line is in the situation that it is, and Merab's getting disrespected despite the style that he's shown. I do think his style, even though I would consider Umar playable in the 300 range just based off of what the raw numbers are telling me, I know that from my experience watching Merab in practice, if this fight goes the distance, which I expect it to, it's going to be on very slim margins in what is going to be a wrestling, grappling heavy matchup. Who's actually going to make the bigger impression on the judges here? And Sandhagen, is a guy that trained up his wrestling a lot. And even though I don't think he really landed much, if any, of the takedowns that he tried to initiate against Umar, if he really did try any, but he was at least scrambling more competitively than I think a lot of people expected in that, certainly me at least, in that UFC Abu Dhabi Fight Night event back in August of last year. So you wonder how someone who's more capable in that area like Merab is going to be able to give resistance to Umar and potentially end up securing dominant position and retaining it. So it wouldn't shock me to see Umar win here. I'm going to say, or it wouldn't shock me to see Merab win here rather. I will say too that if one guy just ends up totally dominating this fight, I think it's much more likely that we see Merab winning like a 49-46 than the other way around. So I still think Umar's going to end up winning a 48-47 where he banks the first 3 rounds and then just kind of does what he can to survive to the end. But like I said, there's slightly better value on the over 4.5 rounds. Merab was technically submitted against Ricky Simon in his second UFC fight, but otherwise has never been finished and has never been finished before the final bell, technically. And Umar is someone that's never been finished either. So I think you have to feel pretty good about this going the distance. I don't want to make it a parlay leg, but like I said, we'll see how things shake out. If it comes to me needing to do that, you could do worse than picking a Merab fight to go into the final 2.5 minutes, right? The one thing I'm going to be worried about is if I avoid picking the Umar money line and then he ends up hurting Merab bad early and Merab ends up getting knocked out for the first time. And it's like, oh my God, I could have just taken Umar money line and lived with it. But that'll be the one thing that'll kill me if I end up making that a parlay leg. So I don't want to have to do that if I don't need to, but we'll see how it shakes out. But give me Umar to win 48-47. Wouldn't shock me to see Merab win 48-47 of his own or a 49-46. If this fight does end in a finish, I'm almost totally convinced it's going to be Umar. But and new for the first fight, the first half of Father's plan relative to this card, assuming you don't count Tagir, is going to be fulfilled. And now we come to the main event. Islam Makhachev and Arman Tsarukyan 2. Makhachev enters 26-1. Submitted Dustin Poirier in the 5th round of UFC 302 last year. I took the under 2.5 rounds in that fight just because I thought, I can't really get behind betting Makhachev at this price against Poirier. And, that ended up being, at least through the first 8 months of last year, was one of the only main events that I got incorrect. One of the only headlining fights in a pay-per-view that I got incorrect. And I believe for a while there, I was hitting pretty accurately on every time I was taking a money line as opposed to hedging on rounds. I would have taken Makhachev to win. I just didn't feel comfortable betting him at 400 or 500 or whatever he was closing against, facing Dustin Poirier. I think it might have been even more expensive than that. Yeah, he closed at minus 660 against Poirier. I mean, there's no way that you're betting that. It's funny, in a future fight against Max Holloway, he's currently a minus 600 favorite too, which come on, that's outrageous. I get it, but that's outrageous. Conversely, Tsarukyan last fought against Charles Oliveira at UFC 300 in a fight that ended as a split decision, but frankly, I didn't think was that close. Obviously, I've spoken about it at length before. Oliveira is my hero. I'm never gonna root against that guy. I'm gonna have a pretty biased view of how all his fights shake out, but as somebody that had Tsarukyan graded to win, but didn't feel comfortable outright playing Tsarukyan against my hero because I didn't want to fade my hero. I decided to take the under 1.5, thinking that, okay, Oliveira's mostly going to force the issue, which is going to lead to either him knocking out Arman, who's been knocked out in the first round before, or potentially getting submitted, or Tsarukyan is going to take advantage of Oliveira's attrition when Oliveira forces the issue and end up finishing him. Oliveira very nearly guillotined Tsarukyan in the first round, but it didn't take. And then I felt like Tsarukyan pretty convincingly won the last 10 minutes up until he was defending that front choke that Oliveira had. And it was funny seeing people that are more seasoned with jiu-jitsu than the average fan, particularly me, talking about on Twitter how Tsarukyan did basically the exact thing you're supposed to do in defending that last front choke that Oliveira had down the stretch. But because the optics of it looked so bad, one of the judges felt obligated to give Oliveira the round over Tsarukyan, which, it was the end of the round. It was a good portion of the last end of the round, and Oliveira's getting close to a fight finishing position, and I get it, but the rest of that last 10 minutes had been almost entirely Tsarukyan's fight. So I had no problem. I frankly had no problem with giving Tsarukyan 29-28, possibly even 30-27, given the fact that Oliveira didn't really end up getting that guillotine in the first. I think that fight was a more impressive win for Tsarukyan than a split decision would have implied. And the UFC apparently felt so too, because he held out long enough that now he is getting his title shot a little under a year later. Now, I did watch the first fight between these two a long time ago, and a lot of people that are betting Tsarukyan here are saying that, he's improved so much since that first performance. How can you not like his prospects in this fight? I don't know how you can say that Makhachev hasn't improved just as much. I mean, this was a guy, Makhachev, who for his, after getting knocked out in his second UFC appearance, 4 of his next 6 fights, including the one with Tsarukyan, ended up going the distance. And then he fought Drew Dober, and prior to getting his first main event against Thiago Moises, and that was when he just started consistently finishing fights, which, frankly, Tsarukyan, you can't really say the same thing about him. Yeah, he's got 4 KOs on his resume. That's impressive, but he's really it's been more decisions for most of his UFC run of late. And I don't think that the guys that he has finished have been nearly the quality of fighters, short of Beneil Dariush. And the Joel Alvarez win is aged well as well, but he was also like a minus 250 favorite for that fight or something. Joaquim Silva, I don't think, is a super impressive finish. And neither is Christos Giagos, really. Certainly not on the level that, Volkanovski or Oliveira particularly Oliveira at like the height of his powers, or Poirier, or Dan Hooker, or Drew Dober, or really in some ways even Bobby Green are. So Makhachev has really blossomed into like an all-around dangerous fighter, not just a guy that was leaning on decisions as much as maybe the narrative had been, especially because, you know, he had been Khabib's protege with that many decisions earlier in his career. It probably would have been easy to say, oh, he's just going to be, you know, this wrestle effort in the same way that Khabib is, and that's the only way he's ever going to win these fights, and just lean on rear naked chokes. And he's blossomed into a very, very dynamic finisher that takes care of even the highest level guys and dispatches them in the lightweight division. So I don't know how you can't say the guy isn't the pound for pound number one right now, and hasn't, you know, on his way to becoming that kind of a fighter. I mean, this was the first time since the this was the first time since after the first Volk rematch, or the first fight with Volkanovski, that I went back and really, you know, tried to see how far he had come. And I mean, you could see in the Poirier fight most recently, I mean, how much more impressive his striking is now relative to where it was earlier in his career. You know, he used to be one of these guys that was really only throwing like 1-2 shots. Now he's throwing much more sophisticated combos. He's doing a good job of working himself into clinch positions where he can be, you know, hitting you with uppercuts or doing dirty boxing or throwing knees, and then using that to set up and drop down into level changes that he could be, you know, shooting a single leg or going all the way down to the floor trying to get an ankle pick to set up a takedown. He just does such a good job of chaining together everything, keeping you guessing about what's going to be coming, keeping everything short and tight and technical. Like, the guy fights at a very, very, very high IQ style that doesn't really waste a lot of energy, and that you have to be a technician on the level of like Volkanovski if you even want a shot at beating this guy. Really, the only bad thing you can say about Makhachev is that he might occasionally give up his back in the event that he has to grapple against somebody else, which is certainly possible against somebody with the kind of well-rounded skill set that Tsarukyan also has. The difference is Tsarukyan doesn't have any UFC submission wins. I know he had a ton of submission wins earlier in his MMA career, but the reality is the guy has not won by submission since 2017. So if you're looking at, I've talked about before how on a very baseline level in terms of looking at potential outcomes for a fight, you can just look at knockout. Who's going to be most likely for the knockout? Who's most likely for the submission? Who's most likely if it goes the distance? There's no way you can look at this and say that Tsarukyan's more likely for a submission here than Makhachev is. Absolutely no way. Even with both guys having never been submitted in their MMA careers. I don't know how you can possibly say Makhachev isn't more live for the submission. In terms of the knockout, it's close. Both guys hit hard, and both of them have been caught in the first round before. It's only happened once in the case of both of these guys, but the fact that they've been chinned early in fights already that we've seen, it tells you that there is the potential for them to get caught. I feel like I kind of got to give the edge to Makhachev just because Tsarukyan is a little bit sloppier, just because he's throwing a more flashy style of strikes that sometimes leaves him exposed. You know, a lot of people harken back to the axe kick that he threw against Oliveira that just kind of barely glanced Charles. I don't really think it did any tangible damage, but because it was remarkable flexibility, people like replaying it. That's a good example of him being flashy, not of being sloppy. When I think sloppy, I think more of the fact that he threw no less than 3 spinning back fists against Mateusz Gamrot. The second one was the one that led to the controversy where Gamrot probably should have gotten a knockdown scored against him, but all 3 of the refs watching the fight considered it a slip and ended up giving the 4th round to Gamrot anyway. I had Tsarukyan that night. It cost me a winning night. About a month after I started MMA Rax on X Twitter, I was very, very upset about that. I was very upset rewatching that fight for the first time in the lead up to this, but it was necessary to try to get a sense of when Tsarukyan loses to a fighter that can give him a good wrestling grappling look for 5 rounds, what does that look like? And in that fight, I think the 3rd time he threw the spinning back fist, he didn't really set it up or anything, just ended up kind of sloppily spinning around, and it gave the opportunity for Gamrot to, as he had several other times earlier in the fight, take his back during a scramble and build up some control time that gave him an opportunity to just kind of stay stuck to Tsarukyan. And this happened in the 5th round, I believe, and in a round where it would have been 2-2 going into the 5th, and assuming, I don't know if Tsarukyan had already thought he had banked the 3rd or the 4th at that point, and he just kind of taken it off. But, he was in a position where he needed to win that round, and that was one of the reasons they ended up not doing it. So both guys will give up their back, but only one of these guys has proven to be a credible submission threat to do something with it. Tsarukyan, being more of the flashy kind of striker, leaves him open to getting, capitalized on for takedown opportunities like that, but it can also lead to a situation where you get caught by a more technical striker, which is what I think Makhachev has evolved into. And then in terms of fights that go the distance, I mean, Makhachev has never lost going the distance. He did lose the final round to Volkanovski, but I don't expect him to get exhausted fighting in unfriendly territory for that fight. In the same, was that fight in Australia? I'm pretty sure 284 was in Australia the first time. Yeah, it was, because 294 was the rematch in the Middle East. So yeah, they were in Perth. Volk, was able to capitalize. He wasn't fighting on short notice either, the way that he did in the rematch. But, I know Makhachev lost the 5th round of that fight, but had done enough up to that point where he had already taken, what was it? I think it was the first. The first and the 3rd rounds were definitely the best rounds he fought in that fight, and then I think he did enough in the 4th to take that one. I think the 2nd one was the one that went to Volkanovski to make it 48-47. And then Volk obviously got the 5th round too, but wasn't able to finish it. And I know Makhachev was like, there's that funny picture of him like where he's fighting from the bottom in the last minute of the fight, and he looks like he's just drowning. Like, oh my God, I've never been in a position like this. I don't know if Tsarukyan's on the level of Volk where he's going to be able to fight that kind of fight for to make Makhachev struggle like that, particularly because we've seen Makhachev go into the 5th round of, another fight since then against Poirier and end up getting a finish. Whereas the one time we've seen Tsarukyan go the distance, he faded over the last 15 minutes. Maybe not during the 3rd and 4th rounds necessarily as much as the 5th round, but didn't come on strong enough to where he made enough of an impression to get the win, even though, frankly, I felt that he deserved it. So going the distance, you have to like Makhachev. I give the slight edge in terms of knockout upside to Makhachev as well, even though I think both guys could potentially knock each other out. And the submission upside totally belongs to Makhachev based on what he has demonstrated at the UFC level compared to what we've seen from Tsarukyan lately. Before I did that extra tape on both of these guys, I was going to take the over 4.5 rounds in this fight as well. Because in the earlier stages of the week when I got done doing all the grades, the over-under I was kind of surprised it was at a pick'em. 24 hours after that, the over blew out to -175, which was way further up than where I wanted to play it in out of range. And I thought, okay, great. Graciously, the value on Makhachev came down from the 400 range, which I initially thought was too much. I felt comfortable playing him in the 200 range to the 300 range. But after reevaluating his recent performances, after looking at the fight Tsarukyan had against Gamrot and rewatching the fight against Oliveira as well, I feel pretty confident betting Makhachev not only in the 300 range, but if he does get out to the 400 range again, I think you can still probably take your shot with him. Islam Makhachev is in many ways a more technical version of Khabib. Where Khabib was more of a brutalizer, Islam, I think, is even... he's just a more technically savvy version of the fighter that we enjoyed seeing in Khabib, with a little bit more risk attached just because he's not undefeated. We've seen him get hurt before in his second fight. But again, that was almost 10 years ago at this point. Will be 10 years ago in October of this year. He is the pound-for-pound best fighter in the sport right now. It would be very cool to see him eventually move up to 170 to potentially get a shot at double champ status. He's basically cleared out the division at this point. Even though Tsarukyan was able to take away a round from him, 6 years ago almost, I don't think that Tsarukyan has made this enormous evolution enough as the prospect he still kind of is, even though he's built himself into a contender at such a young age, to where he's going to be able to take 3 rounds away from the pound-for-pound best fighter in the sport. I think Tsarukyan needs an early knockout with something flashy, and frankly, Makhachev is too technically sophisticated and defensively responsible to allow something like that to happen. I think Islam is going to win this fight pretty much however he wants to and make another statement. But I'll say that Tsarukyan is savvy enough in his own right that he's able to survive to a decision, maybe take 1 round away, perhaps the second round. Maybe it's 1-1 going into the third after he takes away the second round after Islam has a good first. But Islam makes enough reads at that point with the aid of Khabib that he's able to win the last 3 rounds going away. So give me Makhachev to win a 49-46 decision. But I think if this fight ends by submission, it's totally Makhachev. If this fight ends by KO, I think outside of the first round, Makhachev probably has the advantage. So that's my read for that fight. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 311. Thank you very much for tuning in. I know this, again, said, I'm going to go quick. I felt like I went pretty quick in the beginning. I tried to go as quick as I could with the other fights as able. But again, I was talking about over a dozen fights on this one, so it was always going to go long. And I got to be up early for work in the morning, too. So, great. But, eventually we'll get to the point where this is, totally the full-time gig, and I'll be able to dedicate all my attention to the platform and the content creation for you. But we're still a few years off from that. But while we're in the beta stage, thank you very much for joining me on the journey. One more time, please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. I wanted to do the minute to win it breakdowns last week, and stuff just got kind of crazy. I do have another gig covering one of the teams that's going to be playing in the CFP National Championship next week. If you're familiar, if you've dove into the weeds of the man behind the madness, so to speak, previously. So I kind of had a lot going on last week, so I had to cover the semifinal game. Which I know was on a Friday. I would have to record the minute to win it's earlier in the week, but I can only have the bandwidth for so much. That being said, I doubled my subscriber count last year because I started doing those shorts, and with TikTok about to get banned, I expect the popularity of YouTube shorts to only kind of explode. So I think I am going to be trying to get those up earlier in the week again going forward. I don't know how consistent it's going to be. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it for every single fight on the main card, particularly now that I'm starting to do some women's MMA. But I will tentatively say you can look out for more of those in the future if you're a fan of those. But for those of you that are at least fans of the RAXPOD, let me say once again, thank you very much for tuning in. I appreciate your support on this journey, and we will be back, if not with minute to minute breakdowns, then in pretty short order here for UFC 312, which will be 3 weeks from Saturday, which features another rematch in the form of RAXPOD hero Dricus du Plessis against another hero of MMA Rax, Mr. Sean Strickland. But obviously, if you've paid attention, I'm even more jazzed for the Zhang Weili Tatiana Suarez fight, just because if Suarez wins, she's one of the best stories in sports. And spoiler alert, I will probably end up picking her as an underdog. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Hopefully there's some more bookings for that card, because right now it's looking kind of weak. And by that I mean the featured bout of that card at the moment is Justin Tafa against a Contender Series guy. Gross. But we've got maybe the best pay-per-view of the year, at least as the events are lined up right now. It's certainly going to be one of the deepest for the entire calendar year of 2025 to look forward to. And yeah, I'll be back for UFC 312. But in the meantime, good luck with your action, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, and I'll see you next time.